Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is September 17th, 2021. This has been a very busy week with a number of what might be considered shocking developments. We should probably begin with this special event which occurred yesterday with the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the Prime Minister of Australia announcing a new security arrangement. Helga, this is causing the raising of hackles all over the world. What do you have on this?
Well, I mean, it is obviously, I mean, they claim that it is not directed against any one particular country, but that is sort of not very credible because it's clearly against China. They claim this is supposed to increase stability and peace in the Indo Pacific. The Chinese response to it was that this is creating more instability. And one Chinese comment in particular is, I mean, with that goes obviously the fact that the Australian government cancelled a deal they had with France under negotiation for 12 conventionally conventional fueled submarines, and they are now buying the equivalent number of nuclear uh, sponsored submarines from the United States. Now, the Chinese have made a big point about that because they say, given the fact that Australia is not a nuclear power, that they will now have access to nuclear technology, that this is a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The opposition in Australia, on the other side, they say, that given the fact that Australia does not have a skilled labor force and scientists for nuclear energy, it will basically mean that the dependency of Australia from the United States will be increased, and that it is a big blow to the sovereignty of Australia. So this is obviously a no good deal. I mean, obviously, no ally, no NATO member was informed. The French were completely caught by surprise. The treaty or the deal with between Australia and France was supposed to be signed end of this month. Without pre-warning, this deal was cancelled. It's causing a complete havoc in the relationship between Australia and France and the United States and Great Britain. The French cancelled a big festivity which was supposed to take place, I think, even today in Washington, was cancelled. But again, you have the creation of a new security arrangement involving the United States and Great Britain, who are both NATO members, uh, with a third country, Australia, and they're not informing the NATO allies. This is now the second time this happens. It happened with the sudden withdrawal from Afghanistan, where the United States pulled out overnight without even telling the Afghani allies there, leave alone the NATO allies. So this does not speak well for the cohesion and the trust within NATO. And I think this is another blow. And the consequence of that is NATO is an obsolete alliance. It should have been changed. When the Soviet Union collapsed, one should have offered to Russia to be part of it, which Russia would have accepted at that time. So I think this is just increasing the instability. And, I think, unfortunately, it also tends to confirm what many experts had uh, mooted and were worried about, that one aspect of the Biden policy to end the endless wars by pulling out of Afghanistan has been to shift all attention to the containment of China into the Indo Pacific. And this could very well be one reflection of it.
Now, in doing that, there was also, I think Biden is going to have a talk with the so-called Quad countries, which is India, Japan, Australia. This really is an attempt to create a what they said initially, an Asian NATO. But it's really quite strange that they would do this in the absence of coordination with NATO.
Yeah, I really don't know what that signifies. I mean, what it will do in Europe, for sure, is it will strengthen those forces who say that the Europeans have now to take care of their own security matters. They can't rely on the United States anymore. There are lots of articles and statements saying that Biden is exactly a continuation of what Trump was, by not coordinating with the allies. Now, I think it is just a sign of the time that the trust in international politics is at a low point historically, and that is all by itself very dangerous.
Well, now this occurs at the same time this new book is coming out in the United States by Woodward and a Washington Post reporter named Costa called Peril, which has some very interesting discussion of what General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, did in a sense going behind President Trump's back, assuming the book is accurate. This also is part of the instability, isn't it?
Well, I mean, one does not know if the facts presented by Woodward and Costa are actually correct. So, what we are doing right now, we are going through our own files and look, is there a correlation about what was said, namely that at two occasions, General Milley was supposed to have called the Chinese and assured them that there was no strike coming from the United States. And in one call, he even said that if there would be such a strike, he would call the Chinese ahead of time and tell them. Uh, I mean, this is, Trump immediately said this is treason if it happened in this way. I mean, there were in this period, in the running up to the U.S. election, and then in around the January 6th, the second phone call was supposed to be on the 8th of January. The first was supposed to be on the 30th of October. I mean, there were tensions, and also I think Esper also had contact with the Chinese. So it's very difficult to say because these are obviously extremely classified talks, but what that signifies is that the tension between the United States and China is at an all-time high. I mean, we discussed this, I think, the last time that the Chinese press had two scenarios, that if it comes to war between the United States and China over the South China Sea or over Taiwan, in each case, if it would come to a war, the Chinese would win. And we had basically various whistleblowers, including Daniel Ellsberg, who a couple of months ago had called that there should be a new whistleblower who would reveal the very worrisome discussion in the Pentagon about the possibility, if in such a case, that there would be a war between the United States and China conventionally, and the Chinese would win, would the United States then consider the use of nuclear weapons? Now, again, these are hair-raising issues because I have said many times that I fully believe that if you go to nuclear weapons, that it is the logic of nuclear war that all weapons will be used, and that the likelihood that this would be the end of civilization is very high. And in light of that, if you look at the fact that the head of the strategic command, Richard, uh, General Richard, had already last February changed the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons from not likely to very likely, which is still sitting there. So I can only say we need urgently to go in a different direction, because if you do not leave the field of geopolitics. It is a question of time when, by intent or by accident, this thing will go wrong. So this is why we have to really campaign for the replacement of geopolitics, for a new paradigm of cooperation among nations for the common aims of mankind. If we as a human species cannot muster that kind of a rationality, we may not make it.
Well, and it seems as though there must be this tension is obviously felt among the military leadership. In addition to what Woodward said, General Milley said, you had this speech by General Hyten, who's the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, last week, where he said, our goal is to never go to war with Russia and China. So I think Ellsberg's point is that this should be brought into the open rather than have it go on in the background. Now, this seems to have been pushed forward, these kinds of tensions and debates, by what happened in Afghanistan and the whole question of what happens now. It's clear that the humanitarian crisis that you were warning about, if it's not addressed, will overwhelm that country. What can you say about developments toward coming to a resolution there? Anything moving?
Yes, yes, it is very dramatic because, the Western forces basically say, as long as you have the Taliban in power, we will cut off all financial cooperation. The U.S. Treasury froze $9 billion, which belonged to the Afghanistan population. The IMF froze 400 million special drawing rights. So the result of it is that there is absolutely no cash in Afghanistan. Banks have no money. People can take money out of the bank. Therefore, they cannot buy food. They cannot buy medicine. They cannot import anything. As a result, you have now, and obviously this condition existed before because the NATO is only out for about two weeks. There is now food insecurity for 14 million people and 14 million more having just a little bit of food. This is the warning by David Beasley from the World Food Programme. So the population is about to starve. On top of it, you have a health crisis because the donor countries have cut off their previous help. As a result, more than 90% of the population is without medical attention, and about 4,000 medical facilities are being closed down because they have no fuel, they have no electricity, they have, they cannot even keep the COVID-19 vaccines refrigerated because the refrigerators don't have fuel. So this is now causing a humanitarian, and this is threatening the life of pregnant women, of children, malnourished children. And I can only say, if you hear this and then hear the hypocrisy of people saying, oh, we are so concerned about the right of women, the Taliban is not respecting the right of women. They are killing the pregnant women. What about that? I think the hypocrisy on this issue is so absolutely incredible. So what we are doing right now from the Schiller Institute and also the Committee of Coincidence of Opposites, we are trying to mobilize the conscience of the world that attitude has to stop. NATO and the United States were for 20 years in Afghanistan, and they're leaving the place, and you have this horrendous condition. If they would have spent all that money for military purposes, which according to some report was 14 trillion from the Pentagon, maybe not all for Afghanistan, but a lot of it, 8 trillion for these endless wars. If that money would have been spent on economically building up Afghanistan, we would not have this situation. So I think that the Western countries, the United States and the other NATO countries who walked away, have an absolute responsibility to join hands with the neighbors, with Russia, the Central Asian republics, with Pakistan, Iran, and India and China, and help in this humanitarian crisis and create real development. I think this is the absolute need of urgent need of the time. And if you, our viewers, agree with that, please contact us, because we need to mobilize an army to accomplish it. And I mean an army for good, not an army with weapons.
And Helga, there are efforts underway from groups like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, some of the neighbors of Afghanistan, to do something. And you participated in a new initiative, I think, yesterday, the Kandahar Initiative, which is moving in that direction.
Yes, this is a new think tank in Pakistan, a very influential think tank. And they conducted the first of what they call the Kandahar Dialogue. And they were so good to invite me, together with Askari, Hussein Askari, also Dr. Kotonov from the Russian International Affairs Council, a very influential Pakistani journalist and a representative of a Pakistan think tank, and also from a Chinese, a very important institution. So basically, we all agreed what is needed right now is economic development. And at this SCO meeting, which you mentioned, which took place yesterday and today is taking place, Imran Khan from Pakistan basically also said exactly the same thing, namely that geopolitics has to be replaced with geoeconomics. And what all these neighbor countries want is stability, because they say that up to now, Afghanistan was the one white spot on the map, because as long as NATO was there, naturally they were not integrated into these projects of the Belt and Road Initiative. But all the neighbors, Russia, the Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, China, they all want the economic infrastructure integration through various corridors and other water projects and infrastructure projects to bring stability into the region. And they want now to integrate Afghanistan. So if you look at Afghanistan from their perspective, from the neighbor countries, it looks completely different than if you look at the historical geopolitical view the Europeans have, or the United States. And I think the neighbors have a much better perspective.
Now, one final subject we should talk about, which you're directly involved in also, a week from Sunday are the elections in Germany. And in spite of what seems to be a lackluster campaign, there are some things going on in the behind the scenes. What do you find most interesting about what's happening with this election?
Well, I think I tortured myself to watch a couple of these debates, the so-called triel of the so-called three chancellor candidates, whereby I must say that the Greenie candidate it's really illegitimate favors, because they only have 15% in the polls and are very far from having a chance to be the chancellor, but nevertheless they have the privilege of getting the same time to portray their ideas. And I think the Greens are the one disaster. I mean, if the Greens would participate in any coalition, having completely changed, I mean, the Green Party is no longer a pacifist country, as a pacifist party as they started. They are now the most hawkish of them all. Baerbock is saying, we need a tough line against Russia and China. I mean, she's like a NATO marionette in terms of the propaganda coming out of her mouth. So the Greens really should not be in any coalition, because not only is their economic policy the death of Germany as an industrial country, but their foreign policy is on an absolute confrontation course with Russia and China. So there are two very good reasons, apart from their silly cultural outlook, not to absolutely vote the Greens. Now, the problem with these other parties, I mean, none of them has really a clear conception. First of all these debates had an unbelievable lack of reality. I mean, if you know what are the important issues right now, the hyperinflation of the financial system, the danger of a confrontation between the West and Russia and China being quite hot, what's at stake in Afghanistan, all of these discussions are completely absent, from these debates. So the voters are really led by the nose and being presented with issues which are really tertiary in importance. So despite the fact that, our civil rights movement, Solidarity, is a small party, nevertheless, I think we are extremely important by bringing in the issues which count, and we are planning to build on that beyond the election, no matter what comes out of it.
Well, I know you've done some spots for television. Our forces are out there organizing. Is there anything else you want to say, Helga? We're pretty much at the end of the discussion. Anything else you want to bring up?
Well, I mean, we had a report that one of my spots was receiving 2.5 million viewers and was 6 in rating on that moment. So I think we do have some impact. And, as you say, there are some things in the background. For example, the head of the Metal Association, Stefan Wolf, just came out and said that Germany urgently must return to nuclear energy because you cannot go out of coal and fossil fuels and nuclear energy and keep Germany as an industrial power. So hopefully there will be some recognition that the entire wealth of Germany is at stake and its condition as an industrial and social state. So anyway, I think that needs to be strengthened, and I can only say that the large decisions are not coming from Germany and they're not coming from the EU. What von der Leyen said about the global gateway to basically challenge the Belt and Road Initiative, it's just geopolitics, and her idea of a European Defense Union, it's still completely in the realm of geopolitics. And these politicians, they don't understand that we are at a historical moment where either we move into a completely new paradigm of thinking, and I have said many times, the difference has to be as big as it was between the Middle Ages and the modern times, which was separated by the Italian Renaissance. And our forces are working to get such a cultural renaissance because, the thinking in the Western countries has really degenerated, that only a comparison to the end phase of the Roman Empire is a fitting one. So we want to have a renaissance. We want to have a revival of classical culture, of which we are so rich, but it needs to be strengthened, and it has to be, it has to be conscious in the minds of the population, which it is not very much right now. So we regard that to be one of our major tasks in the period ahead.
Well, I think if people are interested in this, they can go to the schillerinstitute.com and see what our participation was in the Teardrop Memorial that took place to commemorate 9/11, which was recognized very prominently in Russia. So Helga, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.